Welcome, everybody. I'm not sure when you'll be watching this, if it's night or if it's going to be daytime or on the weekend, because this is one of our micro topics. And as we've been doing, I'm getting together with Sensei Suino and also Hanchi Legacy to just talk about different historical figures and their influence and basically what we think of them. Also want to just say thank you very much for following us on Punch Kick Choke Chat. Please go to our website. One of the things we're really pushing people to do on that website is to suggest guests. There's a link there and you can suggest who the guest is and we'll reach out to them and then we'll do all the work. All you have to do is suggest the guest and give us a contact. So the last time we talked, Sensei, we talked about one of your heroes, which Yamamoto Musashi. And it was, I don't think that one's been released yet, but it surely was a good discussion. He's one of your heroes. And
Indeed.
Now we're going to talk about one of the characters in history that is one of my absolute favorite, which is Miyamoto Musashi. Yeah, and I know he's one of your favorites as well. We've talked about him around the campfire before. And yeah, so I think just quickly we'll frame up the history of the time when Musashi existed. And it was a time of real conflict in Japan. It was a time when Oda Nobunaga and the Toyotomi and the Tokugawa families at sometimes were working together. It's kind of like Oda Nobunaga was the guy who unified a big chunk of Japan. And then Toyotomi was one of his generals and he kind of knocked him off and unified even more. And Tokugawa was one of the Toyotomi generals and he didn't knock him off, but he knocked off his nephew. What happened was he said, look, I'm going to die and you're my most loyal guy. And, can you take care of my young son until he can take over? And Tokugawa said, sure, no problem. And then he kind of knocked him off and just unified the rest of the country. But that's the time when Musashi was alive, right? And he has been romanticized in movies and he's considered to be the greatest swordsman in all of history of Japan. One of his nicknames is the Sword Saint. Also a very educated person. So he's a very famous artist. You can see his pictures all over, and a philosopher and a Buddhist. He wrote a book called The Book of Five Rings, or Gorin no Sho. That book, I've read it multiple times. I know you've read it multiple times, different versions of it. Business students read it today. It's a book on strategy. Musashi's a person who fought more than 60 duels and died in a cave of old age. Well, the ripe old age of 63, because he didn't actually live very, very long. He was an unruly youth. He had his first duel when he was 13 against the swordsman, and he won that. He did it with a bow. He fought in various conflicts. There's things that used to say he fought against the Tokugawa, but now, as we were discussing before the call, it's come to light that he probably fought with the Tokugawa clan and for them. He formed a style of swordsmanship called Niten Ichiryu, or some people call it Nito Ichiryu, which is the two heaven or two swords become one style. And before we get into a couple questions, the one thing he wrote 21 articles just before he died that explains how he chose to live his life. And I don't want to read all of them. I'm just going to read a couple of them. It'll give people a flavor, right? So do not seek pleasure for pleasure's sake. Think lightly of myself and profoundly of the world. No regrets for past deeds. Never jealous of others over matter of good or evil. Stay clear of the path to attachment. I adhere not to superstitious beliefs. I spurn not death in the way. I did not seek possessions or fiefs for my old age. Respect Buddha without asking his aid. I never drifted from the way of combat strategy. So I think that frames it up. Anything you want to add to that before I start asking a couple questions for us to banter around?
Well, I think those things will roll, a little bit more history will roll into it as we converse. I thought we could just kind of dabble in some of his battles as we go through his life. But if you had some questions you want to pose first, I'd love to hear them.
I guess the one thing is the thing we talked about before, which is because of the history and politics and social structure of that time, I think it was the perfect storm for a person like Musashi to like come to light and be able to stomp through the world the way that he did. I'm not sure it could have happened. Definitely not now. Like you would end up in prison or something. So, yeah. What is your thoughts of that time in Japanese history? I know you're not like super dates and facts type of history person, but
not a historian, but definitely a fan of Japanese history. My thoughts are kind of related to what you said. You know, that was a fairly unique time in the world when it was this isolated culture where physical combat was encouraged, and they revered people who were really good at it. And so if you became somebody that was good at swordsmanship or jujitsu, you could go around and teach it. You could have battles. In sword, you could have battles where you agreed we're not going to kill each other, or you could go fight to the death. And perhaps that person's relatives or the court of a king would come and get you, come after you. But it wasn't like they were trying to arrest you. And, you know, you tried to do that in modern day Canada or United States, you know, you'd be rightly so, you'd be branded a serial killer. You'd get arrested or shot. So yeah, the level of skill he got was obviously due to his obsession and constant practice and innate ability, but also to the fact that he lived in a culture where for 50 years he could kind of go around and hone his skills, right? Actually get into life and death combat.
yeah, I think they said his parents kicked him out of the house when he was 13 because he was too unruly. He just, you know, he was always picking on the servants or his siblings, and so extreme, in fact, that when he was 13, he had his first duel, as I mentioned, and killed another swordsman who was an adult at the time. Sensei, what about, we're talking about the culture a little bit, and for a lot of people, like the thought of having a life and death battle, like historical context, they can only relate to today, right? Where we have streetlights and a strong political system and cell phones to call for help. And, you know, this was a time when you couldn't do that. And it was a culture where, I don't know, you know, Boys Day, fifth year of life, fifth month, fifth day, where that's historically a samurai boy got their first sword. And I think one thing, if people are listening to this, they were indoctrinated into a culture where it was like considered glorious to die in battle. It was the ultimate you could do as a samurai, was to die by the sword. That's the most, and that's why seppuku came about, because die by somebody else's sword or my own type of philosophy.
Yeah, and it was such a clan-centric culture at the time that those values were useful. You could rise up in the ranks and then protect your clan or protect a cause and die in furthering that cause. You know, what people don't think nowadays, don't think about when they romanticize it, is that, you know, getting killed by a sword is just as gruesome as it, you know, in those days as it was today. So there was a fair amount of psychology, you know, put together in order to A, romanticize it, and B, encourage people to do it. You're just as dead, you know, you're bleeding just as red, and you're just as dead, whether it's romantic or whether it's something to be avoided.
Right. So why don't we talk about a couple of his famous battles and things that kind of like the facts or the legends that surround those things. And legends are usually steeped in some root of fact. So how about Sasaki Kojiro Sensei?
Well, let's save that one, if you don't mind. Let's save that one because it was one of his later battles.
Right.
Let's just go through a few of the other ones. So you mentioned earlier that when he was 13, he challenged an adult samurai, Arima, and I guess Arima was treated Musashi like a child, from what I understand. Of course, these things are all probably apocryphal, but Musashi, who was a young bully, probably an intolerable human being at that time, had a 6-foot staff and beat him to death with the staff. So that'll tell you something right there. And that's age 13 against an adult. By the way, Musashi was big too, right? From what I've heard. Yeah.
Like clearly ahead of his time, right? Big, intelligent, like philosopher, skilled, like, so. Probably
Yeah,
at
and
13, he was more capable than many of the adults of the time.
right, right. He was 16 when he had his second duel. And you say your understanding is that he did fight at the Battle of Sekigahara?
They said not the war, like not the battle, but the conflicts. So there was a
Okay.
number of skirmishes that actually took place, like smaller battles, and he fought in those.
And supposedly, from what I've read, that's what led to him being masterless, being a Ronin, right? Is like he was so, they've always said he was on the losing side. He had to, so then he's wandering Japan on a warrior's pilgrimage. And then to me, what's really interesting is that when he gets to Kyoto a little after 1600, he decides to get involved in a contest with the Yoshiokas. And if you're not convinced that he's a badass before that, by the time he's done, you're just going to have to bow down, right? So he fights one of the Yoshiokas, and they agree that they're going to, just fight with Bokken. So it's not to the death. Musashi wins, breaks Seijiro Yoshioka's arm. Yoshioka retires as head of his sword style and becomes a Zen monk. So then his brother, I can't even pronounce his name, Denshinchiro, decides he's going to regain honor. So he wants to fight Musashi, and they agree to fight to the death. And Musashi, even though his opponent has a live sword, Musashi fights with a bokken and won easily, right? Kills a guy. And of course, by now the Yoshiokas are reeling from this. So finally, when the new head, this is Mata Shichiro, who's 12 years old, they decide they're gonna trick Musashi. They're gonna say, why don't you do a duel with this kid? And so Musashi hides. He goes early and hides. And this is the beginning of his what do you want to call it? His sleight of hand, right? Or magic tricks. And sure enough, as he suspected, this 12-year-old kid shows up with a retinue, and they got all kinds of weapons. Musashi steps out, cuts the kid's head off, slashes his way to freedom, and the Yoshioka style was never heard from again, which I just love.
Yeah, that was like a very prominent style too, right? That was like supposedly one of the major ones of the time, and considered to be one of the more combative styles as well, I think.
And what's interesting about that is it was probably a fine martial arts style, like as far as we know, right? Tactics were good, people were good, but it's like being Phil Mickelson during the Tiger Woods era. You're just always going to get your ass kicked. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's true. And well, we're going to talk about it more, but one of the things that I like about the final thing was, he was supposed to meet them at the top of the mountain, but he was at the middle of the mountain watching the path to see who was going to come, and just thought, I'll be able to get up there. And then when he saw that they were going to cheat, he was like, okay, well, then all the rules are off then. Like, if you're going to break the rules, then I'm going to break the rules. And one thing I thought about in that time, like those engagements were very constructed with a lot of like social baggage wrapped around them about how you did it, where you did it, how you announced yourself, and your whole lineage. And no, when he fought them, it was like maybe the first two matches were like that, but that third one, there was no talking, just a lot of cutting.
Yeah, and I think he learned his lesson. From what I understand, a lot of the battles after that, he would employ that: show up early, show up late, try to get the guy angry, whatever it might be. Make sure he had a position where the sun was behind him, so it was blinding the other swordsmen. Just, he was a master of strategy, and it wasn't just like, how do I wield this sword?
Right. So who do you want to talk about next? How about Gonosuke? Do you remember that person, Gonosuke?
I do, but it sounds like you have a couple of things you want to share on that topic.
Well, Gonosuke was one of the only ones that they say ever actually defeated him. And Musashi was the one who said he defeated him, and it was because he actually touched him with his bow, right? So he faced Musashi, and that was before Musashi had developed his two-sword style. And they say that that's the reason why the two-sword style came about, was because of his fight with Gonosuke. Gonosuke was known to be like this peacock kind of person who, dressed really flamboyant and really liked the ladies, and kind of like the opposite of Musashi, who never dressed flamboyantly. He was always kind of Well, some people said he was actually smelly and unkept a lot of times. Like he just didn't care about that stuff.
Yeah, when we get to the Sasaki Kojiro story, I'll have some more on that topic as well.
Yeah. So apparently when they dueled, Gonosuke touched him with his bow, and then that, so Musashi said, okay, you beat me. And then he went away and meditated about how to overcome that. And that's when he came up with the two sword style, because he would be able to use his long sword to do something and then get inside to fight on the inside with the smaller sword. But so then he meditated on that, worked on that, and then went and challenged Gonosuke again. And he won that second fight. And they say that because, you know, Musashi said he let him live because Gonosuke had let him live the first time. So when he won, he did it with the flat of his sword or the back of his sword. He struck him, and that's how he won that battle. So I guess the thought that I have about that is sometimes he didn't follow the rules, and sometimes, but if you read his readings in that battle with Gonosuke, it shows that he did actually have a lot of respect for the people that he wasn't just like this ruthless killer trying to make a name for himself. You know, he did have compassion for and follow the rules for the people who had compassion and followed the rules with him.
Which is always interesting in light of the fact that this is deadly combat.
Right.
Kind of the legend that has been floating around that, you know, that I heard for the longest time was that Gonosuke, I think in the second battle, had a jo, right? Like a 4-foot staff or maybe a 5-foot staff. And one of the arguments is the reason he was able to score on Musashi was the jo has no edge, right? So it has more, you know, infinite directions of effectiveness, whereas the sword needs to be edge first, although that's not strictly true. But it's an interesting one from point of view from strategy, right? From a strategy perspective, is that you're not limited to cuts with an edge. You can thrust with the end and, you know, hit in any direction.
Yes. So which next colorful story do you want to talk about with him?
Well, let's talk about Sasaki Kojiro, and then I want to talk about the Book of Five Rings and some other stuff as well.
Okay, before we get into that one, Sensei, we should talk about the fact that Musashi did oftentimes fight with a bokken because he felt it was unfair to face somebody with a metal blade. He just, because at a certain point when his legend got so big, he was getting challenged all the time. And he just, you know, he was fighting these rank amateurs with a metal blade, and he just switched to a bokken and still killed them all. Right. And as we get into Sasaki Kojiro, that's one. I don't know that that's the case with that particular duel, because what I've read, I don't know what your opinion on it is, that Kojiro is probably the most skilled and best fighter that he ever had to face.
Yeah, and it was kind of the apex of Musashi's career. You know what you said about him taking a bokken to a sword fight. You know, there's kind of an arrogance to that, but it's also probably a recognition that he knew where he was in the pantheon of swordsmen. It reminds me of the night at the Kodokan we spent, right, where we were in the Kodokan and there were 300 judo players there, and there was one guy pointed out to you, and I said, this is the guy, like, right, there's everybody and then there's this guy. And you know, he was arrogant and rightly so, like he was a badass, and everybody went up against you. It's like, you're going to get thrown very fast and violently. And, you know, I don't know how nice the guy was in his private life, but on the judo mat, he was head and shoulders above almost everybody. And I suppose he goes into a battle with a different mindset than people are not sure. Right. Is what it is. Sasaki Kojiro. So, you know, Kojiro was a dandy too. He was always dressed very nicely, and he was famous for using a sword that was longer than the average person. If I have the stories right, he wore it on his back instead of on his hip, right? So they're going to go to Ganryujima, which is this island. It's always famous because it's always interesting because when we met with Paul Martin, who's not a sword master, although he does use a sword, but a master of the Japanese sword construction and identifying. He went to see the site of that battle. And he said he was just surprised by how short the water is between the mainland and the island. Is like, it's a pretty trifling little row, right? But the great story is they have this battle. Kojiro is very well thought of. He's well dressed, and Musashi is such a badass that he falls asleep and sleeps through the time of when he's supposed to go to the battle, and they come in to wake him up, right? Musashi, get up. It's time for your battle. And they bring him some water to wash with. And of course, he's always unkempt. So he drinks the water. He gets up, jumps on the boat. And you can just imagine this. They're rowing over to the thing. Maybe he planned it. Maybe he didn't. But you can just imagine this. They're rowing over there and he goes, shit, I forgot my boat. I don't know if that happened, but he grabs an oar, hacks away at it with his tanto, and makes this sword. And it turns out he's not a stupid man. It turns out that that's longer than the sword of Sasaki Kojiro. He gets out there. Kojiro they're standing on the shore, and Musashi just walks up, whack, and just unceremoniously whacks him in the head, right? Yeah. Kojiro dies, and it's like, what do you do? He's just so much better than everybody.
Well, it's interesting though, because he missed the first duel. He just didn't even go to it.
Oh my God.
He didn't even go, and Kojiro showed up and kind of berated him in front of a whole bunch of people because he was in a bar or something, or carousing, and Musashi just was kind of a little bit flippant and said like, oh yeah, I forgot about that. I forgot I was supposed to fight you. We'll fight tomorrow.
That was not an accident.
That was not an accident.
Right.
No, like he said, like the strategy in the way, right? So of course, if a person's angry or afraid, then they're not going to fight as well. And actually, I think the more angry, it would be the worst one, because people can channel their fear into something that maybe is useful. Whereas when you're angry, things are very clouded. So I think that was a brilliant strategy on his part.
100%.
Yeah. It's really encapsulated very romantically in that book Musashi. If you ever, it's a long book and it's fun to read if you like sword stuff. And it's based on historical events, but most of it is fiction that they've wrapped around it because they're using words, obviously, that nobody could know if they were used.
Yeah, 100%. It's a very entertaining book, but it's definitely fiction.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you, we kind of touched on it, but just about that unconventionality. Like some people say he broke the rules. I kind of think he was an innovator. I kind of think he was an innovator when it came to, and I don't know this to be a fact, but I've always thought of sword as, I've always had this analogy to gunfighters in the Old West, right? That there were two types of fighting that were done. One was what you and I do, Iaido, where it's like, you're either behind or it's a quick draw. And so you got to get your sword out and do the stuff. Or no, both people already had their swords out and they were going to be like, so just like, it's like a quick draw in the middle of the road, or no, you got your gun out and you're going to start shooting at people. I just don't ever picture Musashi or think of him as a person who is like, and I'm sure he did, but stood there and announced who he was or his lineage or all his victories, or which was a big part of the culture back then.
Yeah. If he did do that, it was part of a strategy, right? Like he was thinking about what this was going to do. Something really interesting about that to me, and about Japanese culture in general, right, is innovation is generally stifled.
I know.
Right? Compliance is highly valued, and people really double down on it. In fact, that's a big problem with innovation in Japanese culture right now, right? Is they're having a lot of struggle with an aging population. A lot of their industries are getting a little bit long in the tooth, and they have a lot of trouble innovating. And yet there's so much respect retroactively for people like Musashi, for like Professor Kano, who innovated, right, using old jujitsu and sumo systems to create judo, Ueshiba, who created Aikido, Funakoshi, who unified a bunch of old karate systems. And so, on the one hand, there's this dual mindset. Or on the one hand, you succeed by staying in the path, and then once in a while somebody just has so much either insight or like Musashi, he just had so much violence that they break free from that and they end up doing something really amazing. But
Yeah, look at Oishi in the 47 Ronin. He's another one. Like, just, he was on that path, like you're saying, because he was being to his Lord. He was being, but he broke every other rule in order to be loyal to his Lord.
Yeah, and it's just it's phenomenal when they do. I suspect that it's not easy, right? I mean, the guys that are celebrated are, I just listed off a handful of them in the martial arts world, and there's probably a handful in technology and a handful elsewhere. So it's probably they're celebrated because they're so amazing at what they did. But they still, all of those guys had to break free from the convention, right, and do something new.
Yeah, I'm always impressed by people like that who can, like, he is as relevant or maybe more relevant today than he was then.
Why do you say that?
Just the lessons that he taught, these lessons about strategy and how to live your life. Like, to me, a lot of those are very relevant. Like, you read those things that if people adopted some of those principles, I think, it would be better today. Like, and I think that's why he's relevant, because it's not necessarily anymore about, like, people get hooked by the fact that he was this badass fighter, right? But then they really become curious when they realize he was an author and a philosopher, and they see these paintings and they see the way that he lived his life, and they're like, oh, that's relevant today as well. Like, don't be attached to things on the outside. And yeah, just very principled person who also just clear thinking, like, just clear, like, don't think there was I don't think you could bullshit that man very easily.
Yeah, that's a really good point, right? Is that the clarity of thought you have to prevail in a sword fight, but also to write as well as he did, to make decisions about who you're going to ally with and all that kind of thing. Yeah, I mean, he had clarity. I don't know where he got it from, but maybe it was just his method of moving past the madness in his brain when he was younger.
Another interesting thing about him is sometimes when you read like, anybody who's watching this, you can go just type Google, Miyamoto Musashi quotes, and pages of stuff will come up. And I've talked to people and they've said, oh, well, this quote kind of contradicts this quote, and this thing kind of contradicts this thing. And I've always maintained that your ability to have two contradicting opinions in your brain and actually see value in both of them is a really important skill set. And I think that is why he was an innovator, because he could, like, okay, I'm going to follow the path and the things that I'm supposed to do right now. Okay, no, not this time. I'm going to go against that now. But he always maintained who he was throughout all of that. Like, his core of who he was never wavered, whichever direction the wind was blowing.
Yeah, a lot more of us could benefit from that. We have 2 minutes. So I know it always goes by so fast. I thought what we could do is hit a couple of our favorite quotes and elaborate on them a little bit. My favorite all-time simple quote from Musashi is, "The way is in training." And the reason why is because ultimately that settles everything down. All the chap about, we're talking about things and thinking about them. It bears out. It gets that clarity we were talking about if you just train and pay attention and see what really works.
Yeah, and I'll build on that one, Sensei, because the one that I really liked is he said, it's not doing 10,000 cuts, it's doing 10,000 cuts correctly. Right? Which is, again, the way is in the way of training. I quote that one in this dojo often. Like, don't just do it over and over again. Do it as correctly as you possibly can.
Yeah, 100%. And if you do it long enough with enough focus, you get to another quote, which is, he says, there's a couple, he said it several different ways, but perception is strong and sight is weak. In strategy, it's important to see distant things as if they were close, and to take a distant view of close things. And as I get older, I begin to see that, right? That, two people can stand in the same room, watch something happen, say the same words, but not have the same experience. And us oldsters have been in the, and I mean me, have been in the game a long time. We're looking for different things in when we watch somebody in combat or somebody in training.
I would agree with that completely. Yeah. How about if you wish to control others, you must first control yourself.
100,000%.
Right. Yes.
You mentioned one I really like: no regrets over past deeds. Right.
Right.
It's all learning. We're winning or we're learning. And that's a great attitude to take in life, not to be cavalier about failure, but to recognize that if you are trying really hard and you are trying to see to the heart of things, not everything is going to go smoothly, and you've got to move on.
Yeah, I think it also, to me, when I read that one and think of that one, that's a man who killed like 60 plus people, and he slept well at night. And it's interesting because I've said, I don't know if I've ever said this to you, I always call people, that person is a black heart. Like, I have a friend who lives on the West Coast, and I always say, oh, that sensei, he's a black heart. And people are like, what do you mean? Like, he's a nice person, he loves people. And I'm like, that's not what I mean. Like, I mean, if you have a black heart, in my mind, I think Miyamoto Musashi was a black heart. It just means when he does what he has to do, like that night, he's going to sleep just fine. Like, it's not going to plague him. He's not going to be riddled with guilt and that's probably because he feels justified in his actions, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, what are you looking at, right? Are you looking at the expectations of society, or are you looking at your personal direction? I think some of the really successful people, Elon Musk comes to mind. He marches to the beat of a different drummer, right? His goals and who he wants approval from are very different from most people's.
That's right. Yeah. And I don't think he really, he might not want approval from anyone. Right. Like, we've talked about this as well, that detached feeling, right? Like, detached from approval, detached from other people's opinions. And then for me, when I was a competitor, that's when my competing got really good. I got really good when I was detached from what other people thought of how I was doing it, or what I was doing, or how I trained, or yeah.
Yeah, that's funny you mentioned that. It made me think of the fact that one of the things I noticed when I played judo against really, really good competitors was that it was very impersonal for them, right? They were just doing judo, and it wasn't like they were worried about you. They weren't trying to hurt you. They were just trying to do really good judo, and you happen to stand in the way of that.
Yeah, I say that every Friday night when we fight in here, since it's, I tell people, look, don't take it personal, communicate with them, but realize that when you come in here and you put your mouthpiece on and your hand and foot gear, nobody was hoping you were coming in here to kick your ass. They're all just working on themselves. They're all just, and you're there, and you should be working on yourself, and you should depend on that person not to take it personal as well if something happens, right? It's personal if it's deliberate.
Right.
And at your expense.
Yeah. And it's not to say there weren't judo players who were aggressive, or, who maybe were headhunters or whatever, like, no question about that. But generally speaking, the really good competitors I met were just trying to do really, really good judo.
Yeah,
So
that in BJJ sensei is like, when you fight with like a brown belt or a black belt or even like purple belts, I find if it's like a 5-minute roll, they crush you really fast, and like 3 or 4 times in the first minute. And then they're like, okay, now I'll coach you for the next 4 minutes. Like, they got to get their shit done first, and then they're willing to help you.
So final thoughts about Musashi.
For me, final thoughts about Musashi. I love the romance around him. He's an easy person to look up to and want to emulate, even though he lived hundreds of years ago. I really feel like he's a martial artist. You talk about athletes, or like, this hockey player could have played at any time in the history. I think Musashi is a martial artist who he would have excelled in any era of martial arts history, as a strategist, a tactician, and a human being, a philosopher. I think he could have lived in any time and been as successful as he was.
Yeah, I agree. I think that clarity, I like what you said, that really, that was a really cogent point you made. Thought of a lot of things about Musashi, but you just that clarity of point of view that you need to fight life and death battles with a sword, or to write as compellingly as he did. When we say at Punch Kick Choke Chat, if there's one benefit you could have from training in martial arts, even if people didn't train in martial arts, I think that clarity would be one of them.
Yeah, for sure. This has been great, Sensei.
Has been great. I love these things.
Yeah, me too. So thanks everybody for joining in. There'll be more of these coming out. Check us out on the various social networks. We're on all of them: Facebook, Instagram. Again, we got punchkickchokechat.com, www.punchkickchokechat.com. Please go there. If you want to register, that's a good site to go to. You can look at the previous episodes. Yeah, and feel free to shoot suggestions our way for guests, and I'll even throw out like just ideas for the show. Like if you're thinking there's something you want to see or a direction we could take it, we're always open to hearing from people on that. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.